just supposed to be a stronger boomer. Again, this had no effect on me because I'm overpowered. And now on wave 43, I had all 15 of my towers down. Considering Insane Mode is the longest mode in TDS history, having 68 waves, that means I now have to survive the next 25 waves with no upgrades to my defense. That was worrying me a little bit, because every wave was only just going to get harder and harder, so 25 waves later, you could expect it to be pretty dang difficult. In the meantime though, it's wave 46. The game realized that those previous tanks were way too easy, so it sent out some fire tanks. These were immune to the pyromancers, so they wouldn't be slowed down, but they weren't immune to my outlaws, which completely shredded them after I gave them 2 commander abilities. Wave 47 tried some more of these tanks, and they were no problem. Wave 49, guess what? Even more of these tanks, and wave 50 was actually the Molten boss. This guy was the final boss for the normal mode, except because I'm on Insane Mode, I have to beat him, then I have to beat the hard mode, and I have to beat the rest of whatever is in Insane Mode. To get through him though, I just used my commander abilities and my John, and my outlaws, well, I mean, I think you could tell. They did the job. Wave 52 had these Shrike crystals, which just made absolutely big spikes on the track. These things just look cool, but they aren't really dangerous. Wave 54, I saw a Witch Doctor, which was healing the enemies around it. Thankfully, because the outlaws have their little splash damage, they were able to destroy this little horde like it was nothing, even though they were healing. Wave 55 was a cool way to change things up because it now had some of these witch doctors combined with gravekeepers. So I was literally getting multiple easy mode bosses, but they were at the same time being healed. Of course, when I boosted my commanders, it didn't really matter. On wave 58 would come out some Goldens. These enemies were immune to explosions, so towers like Rocketeer would actually not be good for them. Thankfully, I wasn't using Rocketeer, so yeah, just like everything else, they got destroyed. On wave 60, it was time for the hard mode boss, the Golden Titan. This guy had a ton of HP, until I used all of my abilities. This got him pretty low, but it didn't kill him, and he kept spawning a bunch of his little minions to come rush out, but that was way too weak. He just dies. Now there's only 8 more waves in Insane Mode, and I'm gonna be honest, Insane Mode was actually pretty easy compared to what's coming next. There was just some frozen enemies that came out, which had quite a bit of HP. On wave 65 there was a Frost hero, which, without using any abilities, actually got pretty far down the track. Wave 67 would double that number, and I was still gonna try not using any abilities because I was saving them for 68, and I'll just tell you, they got a little bit farther than I wanted to, like actually towards the back of the map. But here's 68, the final wave which spams you with a bunch of enemies and 3 Frost heroes. This is one of the strongest waves in the game, only a couple hundred times easier than what I'm going to be doing later. That is not a joke, but you know, I boost up my commanders and yeah, Frost heroes kind of get shredded. They still make it pretty far because there's 3 of them, but the 4 main modes are now all essentially completed. So it's time to move on to the events. Area 51. This is the only event in TDS history that had a boss that could literally shoot and kill your towers for good. He wouldn't just stun them, he would kill them. I was going to use the same exact loadout I did for Insane Mode because, well, it's a good loadout. And the early game looked a little bit the same, where I used John's, tried working for that level 2 upgrade because, you know, 5 damage a shot is pretty dang juicy. The save up took a bit, I had to leak some enemies, but after I got it and started destroying, it was time to get some farming done. As I thought the game was just giving me a bunch of free money, it sent out these Zoomers. These guys don't have that much HP, but they're fast, and there's a lot of them. So what I did was I placed another farm. I mean, I guess that doesn't make the most sense, but after I skipped, I had enough money to upgrade my other John, which was thankfully strong enough to counter these Zoomers. The game also sent out these lawnmower-looking aliens, which actually have a ton of HP. I even ended up leaking one of them on wave 10, and this was actually kind of scary, but thankfully, I was able to tank it, but realized we can't let this happen. So I placed down a turret, and as you can imagine, the turret makes a pretty big difference. On wave 12 there was some hidden Zoomers, but it's a little known fact that these things were actually glitched back in the original TDS in 2019, and this game, because it's an accurate recreation, actually made them glitched as well, so they weren't even hidden, and with my turret and Johns I was able to shred them. In fact, the turret and Johns were strong enough for me to get all of my level 3 farms just before these UFOs. These guys are flying in the air. Thankfully, that doesn't mean that my towers can't see them. Back then, there was no such a thing as flyings, like in modern hardcore where you need Ace Pilot or something to take down the flying enemies. Instead, you could literally just shoot them, right? it's kinda cool how old TDS had more logic than the modern one. Anyways, on wave 17 I got paid $50,000 just as the game would start sending out these raiders. These guys were so much stronger than the enemies I was seeing before, and they were just continuously stunning my stuff. So it was time to get some outlaws down because they were unstunnable, even though I believe they should have been. It might just be a bug. But yeah, with these 2 outlaws, a commander, and an upgraded turret, it was actually not that difficult, especially since the raiders would just be stunning my farms a lot of the time. Speaking of raiders, wave 18 had raider 2s. These were basically just stronger raider 1s that stunned my towers by shooting frost beams at them. Thankfully, not all that difficult because my unstunnable outlaws just took care of them. Wave 19 was more of the same, and I maxed out a commander, but wave 20, well, it was time. Just the previous wave, I was fighting 2,000 HP Raider 2s. Now it's time to fight a 40,000 HP Raider boss that, keep in mind, could kill my towers. I began by selling all of my farms and spamming down commanders because I was planning on doing my trick where I just use all of their abilities. Raider boss saw this and thought, oh no you don't, and just killed one of my commanders. Unfortunately for him, I had 7 more, and after using all of them, I was actually dealing some pretty hefty damage to him. I started rebuying commanders to use their abilities again, and what do you know? He kills another one. At least he's not killing the outlaws. We don't have to tell him about that. But I placed down a bunch more commanders, use an ability, and that actually gets the outlaws firing fast enough to the point where the raider boss is low. Unfortunately for raider boss, it is too late. I've dealt too much damage and my outlaws have range on him for a while. I start placing down a bunch of Johns because I wanted him to kill them, not my outlaws, but when I turned around I noticed only 1 outlaw was left on the cliff, so he did kill an outlaw. But didn't matter, I beat the raider boss, which actually turned out to be
仔仔又瞓唔着，睡魔召喚。臨瞓前用 Mac Rhythm 兒童蒸氣溫熱眼膜，幫小朋友呼呼入睡，失眠拜拜，媽咪安心晒。
easier than I thought, and so there were only 2 more things to do. I mean, how hard could it possibly... I'd regret saying that. It was actually really difficult. Sword fight on the heights. This event is absolutely no joke. You can actually play it on multiple different difficulties, and I tried it on normal mode, only to realize that there's absolutely no way that I was going to be able to win because there's just so many enemies. I mean, what can you do about all that? So for the first time, I actually had to get a team because of how hard this event was. Fun fact, I actually played the real thing back in 2019, except it was too hard and I lost. That's just to give you some perspective, but regardless, we got a team of 6 and we'd end up playing on insane mode. Thankfully, the early game was looking a lot easier. It was sending out a bunch of really high HP enemies, but because the game spawns us in with over $2,000 of starting cash, we actually had some minigunners, an outlaw, and a commander right off the bat. In my loadout, I brought Commando, which is the event tower that you get from beating Raider Boss, and it was also one of the strongest towers at the time, so I thought it would be pretty good. I'd used Rocketeer early on because there were a lot of hordes, and everything was looking pretty reasonable early on. We were killing most things at the front, and for a defense that consisted of outlaws, minigunners, a commando, a commander, a Rocketeer, and everything, this seemed like it was going to be pretty easy. But then came out Wave 8. This wave had a Crystallite with almost 2,000 HP. On Wave 8, thankfully we had enough preparation to take it out, but this was just going to be the start. On Wave 9 there were 2 Crystallites with a bunch of mystery enemies, which now started punching back pretty far through the range of our minigunners. Not to mention our stuff would also just get stunned whenever they died, so that wasn't very fun. On Wave 10, there were some of these brutes which work exactly like the tanks would in insane mode, so they'd just go around throwing rocks at our stuff and stunning it, while the Crystallites with a bunch of HP would be tanking all the hits. Despite this brutal combination, we somehow managed to take it out. And I would upgrade my Rocketeer because the hordes were starting to get pretty dense, you know? And so Rocketeer was getting in some pretty decent damage, but the stuff just kept pushing further and further. The combination of all the difficult enemies was unreal. But on Wave 12, yes, only 1 wave later, it was time for the final boss, Swordmaster, with over 120,000 HP. Keep in mind, just the previous round, the stuff had only 2,000 HP. So I had to sell all of my farms, which I expected to be using for at least like the next